Is Amy Combs, and I am the executive director here at ECAC, the Exceptional Children's Assistance Center. And it's been a minute since I've done a Tool Time Tuesday, so I am feeling a little rusty, but hopefully I can pull it off. But today's segment is going to be about what makes a student eligible for an IEP or an individualized education program. And I don't know if we have any Spanish speaking families joining us, but our friend Felipe from Full Circle Interpreting is going to put some instructions in the chat box. He may have already done that for those of you that need to access this information in Spanish. So, first question, how's the school year going for folks? Feel free to put it in the chat and let us know. See if we get any feedback. All of my kids are adults now, so I don't have any kids in school anymore, but I've have three grandkids in school. And so far it sounds like it's going pretty well. So yeah, if folks don't mind. I love interaction. So got something on your mind, want to tell me how school's going, love to hear it. But we will go ahead and get started as soon as I get my slides to advance. Okay, so when it comes to determining eligibility for an IEP for a student, only a public school's IEP team can make that determination. They are the ones that will determine whether a student qualifies for special education services through an IEP or the individualized education program. And so the IEP team includes the parent, as well as a group of qualified professionals. I'm in a lot of Facebook groups that are geared towards parents of children with disabilities, and I saw this conversation come up recently, and somebody said, is the only way to get an IEP through the school, and I was surprised to see how many people said, "Oh no, I got one through my doctor," or "No, you can get one this way or that way." And that is false information. And so I was kind of like, no, you can only do it. And people were challenging me. And that's the thing about the internet. There's some really great information out there, but there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so I think it's important that folks know that an IEP can only be created by a public school. Uh, I don't make the rules. I'm just letting folks know. And the schools, they have to follow very specific rules when they evaluate children. And so it is important to note that having a private evaluation or a diagnosis does not automatically make a child eligible for an IEP. That information is helpful for the IEP team, but there's no automatics in special education. Most answers to most questions are it depends. But when it comes to, I've seen some folks say, why do I have to get, I already know that my kid has autism, or I already know that my kid has dyslexia. Why do I have to have them evaluated? Well, because there's certain rules in place at the federal and state level that says there's a whole process that has to be carried out in order to develop an IEP or in order to determine if a student is eligible. So, the IEP team, they'll make this determination on whether the child requires special education services after considering information from a variety of sources. And that word variety is super important. Folks should not be making this decision based on just one data point or one source. They really should be looking at the big picture. And so the variety of sources could include observations, perhaps formal and informal assessments of the child's abilities, their skills, their functioning, parent input, and teacher input, as well as information about the child's physical condition, their developmental history, their social or cultural background, and their adaptive behavior. We'll hear a lot of families say that they've requested an IEP and are told right from the get-go, oh, he or she is not going to qualify because they're at or above grade level. Well, that would, be a predetermination, but also it sounds like folks are just considering one source of information. There are students out there that may be performing well due to a lot of effort on their part, or they may be getting private tutoring or private services. Um, you know, they they need to look at the whole picture. And so grades, is not a good grades is not a reason to say no. If they look at the whole picture and they go through all of their assessments and all of their required eligibility components, they could still get to a no, but it can't just be, oh no, look, he's doing great in all these areas. That would be just looking at one source of information. So it is important that folks come to the table with a variety of information. And parents, you know your child best. You're in it for the long haul. You've been around the longest. You care the most. And you have some really good input that the team can benefit from. So make sure that you come prepared to talk about those things or bring those outside reports because they can be helpful for the team making a determination. So, when it comes to considering eligibility, the IEP team must determine that three things are true. The first thing is the student's going to have to meet the criteria for one or more of the 14 disabling conditions. And our next slide will go over what those 14 disabling conditions are for North Carolina. The second thing that has to be true is that the disability must have an adverse effect on their educational performance. And sometimes folks, in their minds, they limit the educational performance to just the academic piece. Where they'll say, well, again, Andrea's making really great grades. She scores well on her tests. She's at or above grade level. She's excelling in this area. But Andrea might also be spending a lot of her day in the principal's office or constantly having to be redirected. And so sometimes we'll see this with some of our kids that might have high cognition. Maybe they have some significant behaviors. And so, again, that functional performance is part of the educational performance. And so we can't, again, just limit it to how the kid is doing academically. And then the third thing that must be true is that the disability must require specially designed instruction. So special education, if you will, something different than what they would be receiving in that gen ed classroom. There's a lot of disabilities out there where the student might need accommodations and not something from a special education teacher. And so we'll see that some students might be served under a 504 plan because maybe they need extra time to complete work or test. Maybe they need to have their tests taken in a separate room away from distractions. Maybe they need to have access to large print or a sensory item. Those would be accommodations. That is not a special education teacher or somebody changing the instruction for them. They're just kind of giving them some access to their learning environment by providing accommodations. So all three of these things have to be true. If one of them is not, then the student will not be found eligible for an IEP. So I mentioned in North Carolina, we have 14 disability categories, and they are all listed here. Autism, deaf blindness, deafness, developmental delay, emotional disability, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech language impairment, traumatic brain injury, or visual impairment. Sometimes folks are surprised that, where's ADHD? So there's not a specific category called ADHD, but students with ADHD might be found eligible under the category of other health impairment. In order to be considered for that category, the student has to have a condition that limits their vitality, their strength, or alertness. And they'll need some accompanying documentation from a doctor to verify that they have one of those conditions. Sometimes we'll see a student with anxiety served under other health impairment. You won't see dyslexia listed as a specific category. However, dyslexia could fall under specific learning disability, or dyscalculia also. And so there are certain, you don't see a condition for Down syndrome, but that student might be found eligible under the developmental delay category or the intellectual disability. And so you'll see that there's a variety of categories, but there's not a category for every diagnosis or condition that is out there. I did want to touch on the multiple disabilities category. When folks contact us on our website, they, will ask them, which of these categories is your child being served under? And many will select multiple disabilities because maybe they have a child with autism and ADHD. That's not actually what that category means. It typically is for those students that maybe have significant impairments, so much so that they can't single it out or identify a single category. So you might have a student that maybe their primary category is autism, but they might have a secondary category of other health impairment because of their ADHD. Or the IEP team might come back and say, we know that he has a diagnosis of multiple things, but this is the category that is having the most impact educationally, and they'll select one. So let's talk about that adverse effect. That was the second prong, if you will, the second thing that had to be true. And when it comes to adverse effect, it means that the disability would interfere with the child's progress to a degree that some level of support is needed. The impact could be mild, and for some students where it is mild, the interventions and or accommodations could possibly effectively address this without an IEP. When it comes to the different areas to consider, we've got some listed here. It's not all inclusive, but here's some ideas of what we're thinking about with academic. I don't know why. I made this in Canva, you guys. And then I guess when I downloaded it to Adobe PowerPoint, it messed up some of my fonts. That academic, that C should be up there, and that's going to drive me nuts. So sorry about that. I will send out the slides and I will fix them before I do. And so when you're thinking about what are some of the academic areas where there might be an adverse effect, it could be their written expression, it could be math calculation, their math reasoning, it could be reading comprehension, could be their basic reading skills, listening comprehension, could be fluency, could be oral expression. Some of the functional areas that folks might want to look into would be behavior, communication, could be their social emotional skills, their self-help skills, organizational skills, attention challenges, could be their daily living skills or their vocational skills. You see a lot of families where the functional piece is where there is more adverse effect than the academic piece. And, we'll find out like, oh, the kiddo was kicked out of, three preschools um, prior to starting school, goes to kindergarten and then is getting, sent home early or getting in a lot of trouble. And then folks are saying, but yeah, he or she's really smart. And it's like yes, we agree. However, they have there's an adverse effect on their functional performance, and that is still interfering with them being able to access the curriculum or their school environment. And so maybe we need to look at this and not focus on the grades, but also look at the variety of other sources of information. So when it comes to the adverse effect, the other thing that the team has to take into consideration is they have to determine that the student's educational performance is not primarily caused by these things below. And so one of the things the team they have to check all these boxes, and they're going to have to say, okay, we see there's an adverse effect, and we agree that it's not primarily caused by a lack of appropriate instruction, could be in reading. Um, it's got to be that it's not a lack of appropriate instruction in math, and it can't be because of a limited English proficiency. And so sometimes we will see, years ago, I was helping a guardian ad litem that was had a foster child that had missed a lot of school. And so when they had the IEP meeting, they couldn't determine if the student was doing so poorly because he or she had a disability or if it was because the child just hadn't been exposed to appropriate instruction. And so they ended up not finding the child eligible. But after the child had been in school for some time, they revisited it and they did find him eligible. And so they do have an obligation to make sure we don't want to misidentify students. We don't want to underserve. We don't want to overserve. So the team can, again, looking at the variety of sources of information, and clearly they must have had an attendance record on that kiddo to say, we're not sure that this kiddo has a disability. It could just be that they haven't been exposed to the classroom before, or haven't been exposed to reading instruction before, or math instruction. They also have to make sure that the performance is not primarily caused by a limited English proficiency. And so maybe it is a student that has been in a home where they speak another language, and now we're putting them in an English speaking classroom. And it's not that they have a disability, they just haven't been exposed to the language and don't know the language and aren't able to demonstrate their knowledge. And so these are things that the IEP team has to consider and rule out before determining that a student is eligible for an IEP. And the third thing is the disability must require specially designed instruction. And so when you're thinking about specially designed instruction, we're talking about adapting as appropriate to the needs of an eligible child, either the content, the methodology, or the delivery of instruction. And so specially designed instruction is intended to address the unique needs of a child that results from the child's disability. And it is to ensure that they have access to the general curriculum so that they can meet the educational standards that apply to all children. And so sometimes when we're talking to families, we'll say, think of it in terms of what's going on that would require them to need special education. Or sometimes specially designed instruction can come from the speech therapist or the speech pathologist. What do they need done differently than what the gen ed teacher is providing? And so, in order to be eligible for special education and related services, the student must meet the criteria for a disability. Again, meet the criteria for one of those 14 categories. They have to have a disability that has an adverse effect on their educational performance. And again, we're talking about, yes, academically, but functionally as well. And the disability must require specially designed instruction and related services if applicable. So related services you're thinking about could be occupational therapy, it could be speech therapy, it could be physical therapy, it could be vision and hearing services. There's a big old list of a variety of related services. If the answer to all these things, if the team says, yep, 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 then yes, the student meets all three of the eligibility criteria required for special education and related services. If one of these is no, then it's all no. Then the student does not meet all three of the eligibility criteria required for special education and related services. With those 14 categories, each category has the disabling conditions. Each of the 14 has their own required eligibility worksheet. And I am hoping that I'm going to put that in the chat box if I saved, oops, if I saved that link. Yes, okay. So I got a little typo in here. On the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction website, I put a link there. Is it showing up as a link, Andrea, or is it just showing up as text?
No, just text. I can find it too and post.
Okay. Andrea will fix that for me. So on their website, if you were to go under, Andrea, it's under like policies and procedures, then you scroll all the way down, there's forms. You can find every eligibility worksheet that is used for each of the 14 categories, and they have them available in English and in Spanish. And then you can see that each category has required assessments, evaluations, observations, could be response to interventions. It'll let you know what all the IEP team, what needs to be done in order to determine eligibility in that area. And this is why a lot of parents get frustrated. They're like, look, I already have this private report. We already know these things about this child. Almost always, there's still a missing component with those private evaluations, such as most of our eligibility categories will require some level of observations of the student in the educational setting. And so even if they have that private report, there's some things their own staff are going to need to see and observe. And that can be frustrating for folks because it's like, what did I pay for all this? And that information is super helpful. You guys should bring it when you bring it to the IEP team. They have to consider anything that you share. I do realize that consider is highly subjective because they don't have to follow everything, not all the recommendations that are in there, but they have to consider it. And again, if you have a diagnosis, schools don't diagnose, and they can't undiagnose your kid. And so that is that is relevant to bring that. Like we already know that my child has a diagnosis of this. They could come back and say your child's not eligible. If they do that, they have to document why, but they can't come back and say we don't believe that your kid has this diagnosis because again, they don't diagnose or undiagnose. The other resource that Andrea is going to paste in the chat box will be one of our newest documents. Might be a little blurry here, but essentially summarized all this information in a one pager, what makes a student eligible for an IEP.
I have that one. Still looking for the
Okay, I'll
seeking the
get
right one.
when I stop sharing, I'll go back and I will put the actual link to where those worksheets can be found. I did want to remind folks that special education is not the only way to get help for students who are struggling at school. If you are concerned about your child, you can certainly share your concerns with the teacher, a guidance counselor, school's social worker, or the principal to find out, what kind of extra help is available. Now, saying that, I do want folks to know, oftentimes what happens is families will share their concerns, not realizing that they can also just go ahead and make that request for their child to be evaluated for special education services. Sometimes folks are getting let's wait and see approach, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And so if you make a written request or to say, hey, I'd like to have, I'm concerned, can we just go ahead and move forward with an evaluation? They would have to invite you to an initial special education referral meeting, talk about the student's strengths, talk about the concerns, review any existing information on the student, and then make a determination based on that if they're going to evaluate or not. And again, if they decide not to, that is something else that they would have to document the reason why. Even if you verbally say to somebody at the school, "Hey, I'd like to have my child evaluated," they should in turn say to you, we need to get that in writing. Do you need me to help you with that? But it shouldn't just be a conversation that happens and then nothing happens from that. This is important because once you make that request, it starts the 90-day timeline, where schools will have to go through the entire process to have that referral meeting. Should evaluations take place, do the evaluations, come back at the table, go over all of the information, determine eligibility, and then if that student is eligible, then develop the IEP. There's a lot of, some students, I mentioned the word interventions. There are interventions that schools put in place for students that are struggling. We continue to hear from a lot of families that have been told we can't do anything yet until we do these evaluations. That is a lie. Lie, lie, liar, liar, pants on fire. There's been very clear guidance at the federal level that they can implement those interventions while they are going through the IEP process. And so if you're being told this, or if you have a kiddo that's been on interventions for a long, 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 long time, and it's really not closing the gap, I would revisit requesting that IEP. They should have enough data at that point to say, no, it really is working. Here, let us show you why and how. Or, yeah, you're right, this isn't working. This intervention may not be enough, and this is a student that might need specially designed instruction. I'm going to open it up for questions. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can go find that link to those forms. And anybody has any questions or comments, put them in the chat. I'll check that in a second while I find that link that I
Yeah, I would say
don't know why it showed up.
we do have one question from a little while ago. I don't want to miss that one. We have one parent that has moved from Arizona and is having a hard time, but she is talking about what about transfer from another state? Wouldn't that be a comparable service plan?
The answer to that is yes, it should be. Unfortunately, we're depending on what state you moved from. Some folks come here and are like, this does not feel comparable at all. What's supposed to happen is if you have a current IEP from another state and you move to North Carolina, the school should implement that plan by providing comparable services until they create a new IEP. And so sometimes they might take it and run with it and say, this is good, this is current, we have comparable services, we're just going to transfer this over, create the North Carolina IEP, we have everything we need. Sometimes they'll say, we're going to have to collect some of our own data. But either way, you should be getting comparable services to what you were receiving. Some folks have moved to North Carolina and felt like, oh wow, I hit the jackpot. Everything's great. And others have moved here and then said, what have I done? Oftentimes, the families that come from some of the northeastern states come here, and it's more than a culture shock because it's like, where are all the things that we had? And so, but at the end of the day, it should be comparable. But again, unfortunately, in the language of the IDEA, the Individuals with the Disabilities Education Act, there is a lot of language that is highly subjective. Sometimes see the words reasonable or timely, or comparable or consider. And that can be frustrating for folks that it's not real clear. But yes, you should be receiving comparable services until they adopt or create a new IEP. I am going to go ahead and launch our poll. If you have been in a Tool Time Tuesday segment before, this is something we got to do. Our funders want to make sure that the information that we're putting out there is useful, relevant, high quality. I am going to send out a follow-up email to everybody that attended today with some additional resources and information. If you are getting stuck in the process, please feel free to reach out to one of our parent educators. We are happy to assist you. If you're just frustrated with the process, we get that. We're here to assist you with that as well. And make sure I'm not missing any other questions.
I don't see any.
I saw that Serena said, thank you for that. I've initiated this special education referral process. Good. Um, there is in the follow-up email, I will share the form that is used for that initial special education referral meeting. I like to share that with folks so that they know when they go to that meeting, here's all the things they're going to cover. Again, if you're a parent and you're in these spaces, make sure that you use your voice and share as much relevant information as you can with the IEP team, um, because you know your kiddo, right? And you know what works and what doesn't work, and where the struggles lie. And so be forthcoming with that information. And let's see here. We have a few more folks that haven't taken the poll, and I know sometimes some devices it won't show up, but if you don't mind, it's just a short few little question or survey questions, if you don't mind answering that. Try to get that email out to you all either today or tomorrow. I'll ask Tony to send it out to folks.
And I'll just
And
add
now
that,
it's party over. It's 12:31. So
yeah,
thank you for joining us today. I'll be back next week. I'm going to be talking about school enrollment options for North Carolina children with disabilities. So see you same time, same place, just different day. It's next Tuesday. Thanks, y'all. Take care. Have a great
thank
rest of your
you.
week.